This is Bill Moyer, host of Reconnect America. I recently had the honor of interviewing former Congressman Peter DeFazio about some of the core causes to which he devoted his 36 years of service representing the people of Oregon's 4th Congressional District. During his final years in the House of Representatives, he chaired the powerful Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. In that role, DeFazio was an outspoken defender of American farmers and manufacturers, who as shippers depend on railroads to keep the economy moving. But those essential producers and shippers were bearing the brunt of the railroad's poor, unreliable service after years of Wall Street extracting record profits by forcing cost-cutting and extractive management practices on the railroads. As you will hear, this was not DeFazio's first time to stand up to Wall Street. Though I reached out to him to discuss rail issues, in my preparation, it became clear that understanding Wall Street's unchecked dominance over the running of U.S. railroads is enhanced by taking a closer look at how, over the course of DeFazio's career, and despite his and many others' best efforts, a deregulated and unaccountable financial sector increased and consolidated its power. From the timber wars, NAFTA, and deregulation of U.S. banking in the 1990s, through more corporate trade deals, financial collapse, and bailouts in the first decade of this century, to the post-Citizens United period, where unlimited corporate money is pouring into U.S. elections. DeFazio's career spanned a political period that I experienced as an activist, engaging in these same battles from the streets, while Peter DeFazio was on the front lines in Congress. Today's battle with what we can safely refer to as Wall Street's railroads is a battle to defend public interests, shippers' interests, and the long-term interests of the rail system itself. It is a battle that can only be understood when placed in the context of what preceded it, and, going forward, requires us to apply those lessons learned. Make note of Mr. DeFazio's story about challenging rail shippers in late 2022. He is referring to H.R. 8649, a potentially powerful piece of legislation that he co-sponsored in his final term with the late Donald Payne Jr., who tragically passed away in April of 2024. My organization, Solutionary Rail, had the honor of providing a briefing to Congressman Payne as he took over the chairmanship of the Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials Subcommittee in early 2021. In that briefing, we discussed how critical it would be to clarify the railroad's common carrier obligations, to revoke outdated service exemptions that harm shippers, and to defend access of passenger trains to reliably operate on shared corridors. H.R. 8649 proposed all of that and more. Peter DeFazio describes why that bill never got out of committee, the lessons of which are clear and extremely relevant today. The call to reconnect America is not about ignoring history, it is about understanding it. This episode builds upon what we've provided in previous episodes by giving you a window into the life of a progressive champion who picked up the baton from those who went before and carried that baton with courage and integrity. Speaking of history, champions, and picking up the baton, we will repeatedly mention Senator Wayne Morse, who also made his home in the Eugene, Oregon area, who also fought for balance in trade, defended labor's rights to strike and collectively bargain, opposed McCarthyism, and eventually lost his seat due to his early opposition to the Vietnam War. The similarities between Morse and DeFazio have been well noted. Morse was referred to as the Tiger of the Senate, and in reference to that, Peter DeFazio earned the nickname the Tiger of the House. Both of these men exhibited a progressive populism that the Democratic Party, as an institution, has largely abandoned. The progressivism they share has never been about performing maximalist gestures. Their progressive populism is about finding common cause with regular people and locking arms for common sense policies that strive to deliver a government that defends their interests against forces that would undermine it. So, I just wanted to introduce this conversation myself to give you a heads up on what to expect and how it provides important context for the work that we are doing with Solutionary Rail and this Reconnect America podcast. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did and value the opportunity to learn from Mr. DeFazio as much as I do. Enjoy. Welcome, former Congressman, former chair of T&I, Peter DeFazio. We are very, very grateful that you have agreed to come and speak with us at what I believe is a pretty important moment in the trajectory of transportation and public interests and in democracy. You've been at the forefront of fights to protect the public interests, the interests of the people of Oregon and all the country, and of course, your specific district in Oregon. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and the place that you live?
Well, I live in Springfield, Oregon, up across the river from Eugene. Southwest corner of the state was my district, very large congressional district, went from Sweet Home to Brookings at the California border, about a 7.5-hour drive. Extremely varied in terms of political perspective, a couple of college towns, and then a lot of smaller towns, rural areas, agriculture, and then, of course, the coastal economy, fishing and other issues, tourism over there. I had a background in gerontology and counseling and got a job with the former Congressman Jim Weaver, did his senior services for a while, went to D.C., did legislative work for a couple of years on various issues, including dealing with the Washington Public Power Supply System. And basically, I did a whole range of legislative issues for Jim. There wasn't a big legislative staff. Ultimately, I really didn't like D.C., so my wife and I moved back to Oregon and ran his district office. And then I wanted to get involved personally, politically, ran for county commissioner from the Springfield district, won. Served a 4-year term. Jim retired from Congress, and then I ran for Congress, got elected in 1986, ran in a primary against 2 Democratic state senators. The money was on them, but I won. It was 33%, 32%, 31%. And I went on to serve 36 years in the United States Congress in a district that started light blue and at the end was red because of the depressed rural and coastal economy areas, specifically relating to environmental issues, spotted owl, reduction in timber harvesting, and those sorts of things. And wanted to be on the Resources Committee because my district is resource rich and also more than half owned by the federal government, and wanted to be on T&I because I've been a county commissioner in a county the size of the state of Connecticut and knew how critical transportation issues were.
Well, I am also struck by the fact that you were chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and that you were engaged in the fight around the forests and spotted owls and adding value to the forest products before they get exported. It seems like you've been able to build a strong relationship with your constituents. Otherwise, you wouldn't have served for a record number of terms. Could you speak a little bit about how that early fight around forests may have influenced your perspective on the Wall Street and other forces in our economy?
Well, we certainly want to get to Wall Street. I co-founded the Progressive Caucus with 5 other people. Bernie Sanders would be the only other one living. At that point, we had Tony Coelho as the whip, and I remember him saying once, well, we've been in charge for many, many years, and the Republicans get all the donations. I'm going to change that. Yeah, he changed it. He also changed the orientation and culture of the Democratic Party. And we felt that there was need for more emphasis on economic inequality, tax policy, corporate dominance, and those sorts of things. So we founded the Progressive Caucus, which is, I think, still the largest caucus in the Democratic side of the aisle. And back to your question about the spotted owl and forest policy, that really was a thread through my entire congressional career. When I ran for Congress, I said that we were harvesting too much timber, which we were, and harvesting the last remaining old growth. I was universally opposed by the timber industry. Some of the unions were a little dubious about me, but they were, in those days, Democrats. And then we had litigation after I was in Congress a fairly short period of time regarding the spotted owl, which pretty much brought the industry to a total halt. which was devastating in rural areas, and to my counties, which got a large share of the federal revenues. So I got deeply involved in the issue and trying to find a balance because I knew we had been harvesting too much, but I didn't think we should harvest nothing. Clinton was president. Clinton, Gore, and a woman named Katie McGinty were very involved in this issue. We actually did a little backyard meeting in a backyard of a timber worker, wonderful old guy who used to put my lawn signs together, retired mill worker, to talk about how we could get to some balance. We had some industry people there, environmental people there. Clinton was there. And then they began to formulate what's called the Clinton Forest Plan. And I opposed the plan. I said, this is not going to solve the problem. The environmental groups wanted to save the old growth, and 40% of the harvest under the Clinton plan would have been old growth. The industry wanted stability, but they would take a lesser number of harvests. And this did neither. The industry got no certainty. In fact, they're still in court, although they've just won a very big case recently. So they're still litigating this issue on the BLM lands and looking at revising the Forest Service plans yet again. Recently, two of the gang four who wrote the Clinton Forest Plan did a presentation at the University of Oregon, and they invited me to come. And Jerry Franklin started out by saying Peter DeFazio was right. We were wrong. Their plan was too complicated, easily litigated, went to numbers, low numbers of harvests that weren't necessary, didn't get at what we need to do to manage our forests back to health, those that have been turned into tree farms, and did not save the spotted owl. So the controversy continues, but that was a dominant strain through my career in Congress.
It's a relief to hear you talk about it. I've always felt that the environmental movement put way too much weight on the spotted owl. And in a way, you then ended up hurting the owls rather than putting the emphasis on the communities that needed to have a sustainable forestry economy. And it feels like a grand strategic disaster that it's taking a long time to recover from. It still reverberates in terms of the kind of populism that we see emergent now and our inability on the right and left to talk to each other.
Yeah, it certainly turned a lot of union jobs away in the woods and in the mills, and longshore jobs shipping finished lumber out of Coos Bay. And a lot of those people are angry. They see little opportunity. It's like a wood version of the Rust Belt in those areas. And I worked hard to represent them, to try and get to a reasonable balance. I once passed a bill out of the House, which would have dealt with the BLM lands, which are critical and unique to my district. And at that time, Greg Walden's district, worked with Greg Walden, Kurt Schrader. We passed a bill out of the House to manage those lands for a sustainable level of harvest. Unfortunately, it was blocked in the Senate with the disagreement with my Senate delegation. And now it's still being litigated. At this point, the timber industry has won, and I'm worried about where it's going to go now. We're going to lurch to the other extreme with the Trump people in terms of this. And balance is needed here, and it's a hard thing to find. Every once in a while, someone would say to me, you remind me of Wayne Morse. And I say, that's the highest compliment you can pay, because he worked for that kind of balance too.
Yeah, years ago, I read a biography of him, and what a great book, what a great leader. The incredible independence that really politically was harmful, but morally and ethically, he took the high road, and we could have learned a lot by following his lead. So getting to populism versus Wall Street forces in our society. You've basically lived as a representative of Oregon through a very large part of the neoliberal model of how we approach regulation or deregulation. I imagine with all of your work in responding to the financial crisis, that you probably have some thoughts about the deregulation of Wall Street that provide a foundation for some of your proposals to re-regulate. And I think as we build this foundation of our conversation around Wall Street railroads versus the people's need for sustainable transportation and economy, I'd love for you to speak a little bit about what it was like to be there during some aspects of the deregulation of Wall Street.
We saw deregulation of Wall Street. We saw deregulation trade, essentially, the so-called free trade agreements, which proved disastrous and basically ended up delivering Trump to the presidency. So I opposed every trade agreement. I remember Clinton and Gore, NAFTA is going to provide hundreds of thousands of jobs in the US. Bullshit. If the entire economy of Mexico, every peso of their GDP, had been spent on US exports, they would have contributed as much toward industry and jobs in this country as the state of New Jersey. And that, of course, was never going to happen. This was all about companies being able to just go over the border and avoid labor laws and environmental laws and dump their waste out the back door, causing horrific problems along the border and their suppression of labor, sometimes violent suppression of labor, and the fake union that they had representing people. So that was a really key point. Those trade agreements were written by and for Wall Street interests. And then, of course, the deregulation of banking that happened with the repeal of Glass-Steagall, I totally oppose that. It allowed banks to essentially gamble with insured deposits, which should never have happened. I mean, they shouldn't be able to use insured deposits. If they want to gamble with their own money, fine. They want to gamble with your savings? No, they shouldn't be allowed to do that. So those two things came together and created a disaster for the nation. Now, '08 was obviously a big inflection point where the speculation on Wall Street in mortgages, slicing and dicing of mortgages, caused a massive collapse of the economy. And one large firm on Wall Street went down, and they came to Congress and said, "Oh, we've got to do something about this, Congress. Got to do something." And they originally sent over, I saw the first draft, and I actually gave a speech on the floor. I had a gold key, which had been given to me by the city of Gold Beach, Oregon, for rebuilding their classic McCullough Bridge with an earmark. And I took the key to the floor and I said, "This is what the Secretary of the Treasury has proposed. We give him the key to the Treasury and he does what he wants with the money to fix it." And I said, "All that money will just go to Wall Street." Then they pulled that back, but they still pushed a bill through the House that would have TARP to primarily focused on Wall Street. And I opposed it along with Marcy Kaptur and Brad Sherman and others. And we actually beat it. On a Monday night, we defeated it. And the country would be so much better off today had that initial vote prevailed. But what happened was the next day, Wall Street manipulated and tanked the market. The Senate came back on Wednesday. Everybody's freaking out. The Senate says, "Oh my God, no, we have to bail out Wall Street. Look at what's happening." The Senate passed a bill, came back to the House, and a bunch of my weak-kneed colleagues changed their vote. And yes, we bailed out Wall Street. Good work. And that's continued under Obama, Bush to Obama. And millions of people lost their houses and they got nothing. They got no help. But Wall Street, they all got bailed out. They got their bonuses, their stock options, and not a single one of them went to jail.
Yeah.
Even though they had committed things that were actionable. The Obama administration, particularly Eric Holder, who he's an advisor to Wall Street, would not want to prosecute any of the buddies he went to lunch with. I think one guy who got a liar's loan was the only person who went to prison. It was a disaster for the Democratic Party. So it started with Clinton and free trade. So in '94, the people in the Rust Belt, the Midwest, the workers, the unions, they stayed home. They said, "Screw you."
Doesn't it break your heart? I mean, to see that kind of a failure of strategy, a failure of service, and how that then ripples out?
Yeah, well, sure. It has had drastic consequences for the nation. There was the free trade debacle, and then, of course, he proposed even more with the WTO, and then MFN for China so they could join the WTO. Another unbelievable disaster. "Oh, we're going to sell so much stuff to China." No, you're not going to sell anything to China. And in fact, we, through our failed trade policy, made China the world power it is today. And under Trump, they're going to eclipse the United States if his policies continue to go into effect, diminishing our international standing and support for the US dollar, et cetera. But the story continues with Obama when he tries to do the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would be having NAFTA worldwide, essentially. Great idea, Mr. President. I sat in a meeting with him, a small group of us, because of our opposition to this. He didn't have a clue about economics or trade. And unfortunately, that became a major, major issue. We finally killed it. We killed it before Trump took power, but Trump claims he killed it. So he got credit with people. Oh, I'm going to save you. I'm going to bring back your jobs. No, actually, we killed it in Congress before he came in. But that's the narrative, and he's been spinning false populism into a movement, the MAGA movement.
Yeah, it's been very difficult to watch from the outside. Backbone Campaign, the organization I'm part of, helped publish an alternative to the Paulson plan that included a Tobin tax, which we'll get to in a moment here. And then we helped the Flush the TPP campaign. It's just been a real shame that we have to fight supposedly progressive and liberal leaders. With friends like that, you don't need enemies. It's like we should have been the populist party appealing to the working class people. And we left Americans behind. And the folks who did fight for them, when we did fight for them, we didn't take any credit for it. So it's very frustrating. It's great to hear you speak about it.
Well, let's talk about what you call the Tobin tax. So Wall Street has collapsed. People like, what's the solution? And I said, well, the solution is very simple. We reimpose a tax we had from 1916 to 1966, a minuscule transaction tax on every trade on Wall Street, and let them pay for their own bailout. FDR got Congress to double the transaction tax during the Great Depression, and the extra money went to the CCC, the WPA, and helped heal the economy and put millions to work. Unfortunately, we did not prevail, and they got that straight up buyout. But I continued to propose the transaction tax on Wall Street to help us deal with our massive and unsustainable annual deficits and debt, which led me to become the first person ever attacked by a super PAC in my election in 2010, which was, of course, a wipeout for Democrats. We lost most of the blue dogs that year. That was only because I had proposed a transaction tax, because the people who run these algorithmic trading systems are dependent upon trading hundreds of thousands or millions of shares in seconds and getting an increment. In fact, there's a great book about boring holes through mountains to run a straight fiber optic line to the New Jersey Exchange from the Chicago Merc, because you could front run the market and buy stock because someone's order is coming, and then sell it to them for a fraction of a penny more per share, but make millions of dollars on these shares, and do that thousands or tens of thousands of times a day. Robert Mercer was the guy who went after me in 2010. It was the first ever, like I say, it was just after Citizens United. So I was the first one attacked by a super PAC. Now, of course, super PACs are dominating, and they're rising on both sides of the aisle, our politics, which is very unfortunate.
Yeah, and you just raised Citizens United, which was another key moment in this larger arc of the arc of the universe bending towards injustice. Wow, what a time to be present and lead in Congress. So following the bailout of Wall Street and the fights against the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other trade agreements, at what point did you become part of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee in the House?
Well, I was on what was called the Public Works Committee from day one of my career. It became the Transportation Infrastructure Committee during the Gingrich era, actually, because he dismantled a number of committees which enhanced the jurisdiction of the Transportation Committee. He did away with the Merchant Marine Committee and other shuffling of things. So T&I became the largest committee in terms of number of members, and had some of the broadest jurisdiction of anything in the United States Congress. Roads, bridges, highways, transit, rail, airlines, pipelines, ports, you name it, economic development, all those were under the purview of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. I served there during my entire career, ending up as chairman for the last 4 years.
It's fascinating, and you took us through some of this other history, the impacts of Citizens United that you felt personally, the trade agreements, et cetera. It seems like it's in this period of time, that mid 2000s to the present, where this phenomenon of what they branded as PSR sorts of starts to emerge. And I don't know if that's exactly the right place to go next, but
Sure. Well, I mean, railroads had been deregulated many years ago. We went from 60 railroads ultimately down to 6, then down to 5. The UP-SP merger had dramatic impacts here on the West Coast. It was disastrous in terms of the service to customers. There was a very, very conservative mill owner here, Aaron Jones, north of town. He obviously didn't support me, but he asked if I'd come and talk. And I went to meet with him. He did have a picture of Wayne Morse behind his desk. And I said, oh, he had Ronald Reagan and Wayne Morse. And I said, well, Wayne Morse. He said, yeah. He said, I worked with him on the issue of log exports. And he said, I was sort of a spy. I went over to Japan and saw what they were doing. Anyway, so Aaron's there and he's saying, I am so angry about what's going on with UPSP. He says, I don't know where my lumber is. They can't tell me where it is. It's not getting to the destination. And, Oregon has a big Christmas tree industry. They weren't going to be able to deliver cars to move the Christmas trees around the country, et cetera, et cetera. So there was tremendous disruption in that merger. And then, of course, freight rates went up. Now that's history. Now we're looking at the next to the last big merger, because after this one, if this one happens, between UP and Norfolk Southern, they will control 47% of the freight market. 47%. They will have the only transcontinental route as a single entity. There are already tremendous abuses going on. Something called precision scheduled railroading created at CSX by
Hunter Harrison.
Hunter Harrison. Yes, he's deceased now. But it was kind of an interesting thing to call what they were doing. What it was maximizing our stock price. Hunter Harrison came there and said, well, this railroad's all screwed up. Every year they spend all this money on new equipment and maintaining the tracks, and they've got all these workers. And the stock doesn't do anything. It doesn't do anything. So this is a mess. I've got to fix it. I'm going to lay off workers. I'm going to retire power, the trains, the engines. I'm going to run much longer trains, and this is going to be wonderful. Of course, it was wonderful for him, the stock options and Wall Street. It was a disaster for the customers and a disaster for the workers, those who lost their jobs and those who were then forced to work in unsafe conditions because of the lack of maintenance and because of the lack of people to properly do the work. And unfortunately, this was like a plague, because then Wall Street said, hey, UP, what's up with you guys? You're doing the same stuff that CSX used to do. You're spending all this money and maintaining your track and buying new equipment and all these workers. Get your act together. Okay, goes UP. Ultimately, it infected the entire industry. Last one to get infected was Burlington Northern. And I thought, well, maybe they'll be immune because they've got Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett doesn't like to chase short-term profits over destructive policies. Unfortunately, when the CEO retired, a new CEO came in. She said, oh, no, we're going to do the same thing. And Warren Buffett, sadly, last year bragged about the massive returns that Burlington Northern was getting because of precision scheduled railroading. And again, it's a disaster for the shippers and it's a disaster for the workers, and has potential for disastrous derailments and other things that can happen under those conditions.
One of the things that struck me in the last couple of years was looking at a Congressional Budget Office report from 2015 and 2016 that estimated the cost to the public of a ton mile of freight moving on a train versus a ton mile of freight moving on a truck. And the ratio is, it costs us in pollution, wear and tear, road safety, et cetera, 8 times. It's an 8-to-1 ratio. So this demarketing, because stuff isn't profitable enough for them to hit their operating ratios. How did you confront that in your committee? What was the battle like there?
Well, I I took it on, but the freight railroads punch way above their weight. I can't quite explain it. Obviously, they have a political action committee. Obviously, they're very generous to their supporters. But during my last tenure as chairman of the committee, I said, for once and for all, I'm going to fix this. We got all these unfair things railroads are doing, like demurrage. You schedule something to be delivered. They don't deliver it on time. You don't know when it's going to come. Then they call you up and say, hey, your freight's in the siding. You got 24 hours to get that out of there. We're going to start charging you a penalty. And you're like, well, you were supposed to be here a week ago. And we had workers waiting, but now we're going to have to. And so at this point, it's a one-sided issue. So I thought, well, we've got to give the Surface Transportation Board more clear authority to deal with abusive practices like demurrage and other things that the railroads are doing and create more transparency. Wrote a bill, introduced it. I could have passed it out of committee. All my Democrats would have supported it. But they're saying, look, it's an election year and, we don't want you to move the bill unless you can get a Republican on it. I was sensitive to that. I mean, a number of people from swing districts didn't want freight rail putting $10,000s of dollars into attacking them or supporting their opponent. So I went to a big meeting, actually it was in the Rayburn building, of shippers and from different disciplines, from chemical industry, the oil industry, agriculture industry. And they're saying, God, we're just getting screwed. Got to do something about this. I said, okay, I've got a bill. Here's what the bill does. And I said, but here's the deal. I said, there's 5 CEOs of these railroads. I can guarantee that every one of those CEOs will call every Republican on my committee. Now, you have hundreds, literally thousands of CEOs. You need to bombard those Republicans with your CEOs calling and saying, wait a minute, we had to kill chickens because the feed didn't arrive. That was a big one. We had to shut down the plant because our raw materials didn't arrive. On and on and on. The complaints were incredible. And I thought, okay, this is great. You know what? I don't think they ever made a single call because they're afraid. They're afraid of the railroads. If the railroad gets wind that they're weighing in against them, then their service might even get worse, or they might not get their stuff moved at all. So I couldn't get a single Republican, and the bill died. And now we're confronted with the fact that it's about to get way, way worse if this merger is allowed. 47% of the freight will be controlled by one railroad, the only transcontinental route by one railroad, all the potential for abuses. And then that will drive Burlington Northern to say, well, wait a minute, we can't compete with that. We're going to have to merge with CSX. And then you're going to be down to 2 big railroads, a duopoly. Now, that's going to be really great for customers. It's going to be great for Wall Street. It's going to be great for CEOs who get stock options. And it's going to be a disaster for shippers, potentially a disaster for workers, and potentially a disaster to the environment with neglected maintenance and the potential for more catastrophic accidents.
Not to mention more trucks on the road with wear and tear and diesel emissions, et cetera, not to mention climate. It was interesting, too, when we saw the threatened labor strike. And I was hoping that shippers would line up and support them and said they were thinking about short term and not long term. And so the shippers, like the short lines, seem to be very, very afraid. And this should be an affirmation of the dangers of this monopoly power, this, captive shippers, and the absolute necessity that Congress step in and clarify the role of the STB to clarify common carrier obligations. I would say revoke the exemptions that they've allowed to service and commodities, because without Congress, we're kind of doomed. Reciprocal switching, when STB stepped out and tried to just do a modest push for greater competition, access to tracks for the big shippers with a reciprocal switching rule, that got overturned in the courts in July. So is this fight that we're coming into potentially a time when we can see some coalition building between shippers? Are they going to find their backbone and work with labor and other public interest groups to hold these Wall Street railroads accountable?
Well, it's going to be their last chance. And I hope they do. I hope they do better. When I offered them a great opportunity and they didn't step up, anticipating things like this might come along in the future. So We'll see. I mean, I've read some press that there's a big coalition that's opposed. Labor's opposed also. Perhaps they will get it together and put together a good team to go to the STB, go to members of Congress and say, look, you're about to see these businesses die because of extortionate by the railroads.
If we were going to take the legislation that you created that would have fixed some of these problems, what would include? Could you tell us a little bit about the bill that you had proposed?
Well, as you just said, the STB, it isn't clear what authority they have. They spent a lot of time on the reciprocal switching issue. You think that that would fall totally within their purview, but no, the court ruled that they did not have that authority. So I was going to give them clear statutory authority to deal with fees charged by the railroads, where we're seeing a lot of abuses like demurrage, which we talked about already, and other ancillary fees that are not at all transparent, switching fees that aren't transparent, and sometimes are outrageous in their costs. The bill was just clarifying the law for the courts, and especially since the Supreme Court ruling last year that there's no longer any deference to agency experts, that it's up to the judge to determine what should go forward or not and what kind of regulations can exist or not. And the massive push for deregulation by this administration, they might even try and say the STB doesn't have the authority over the merger, which would be, to me, that's really clear in the weak law we already have, that they do have authority over the merger. But the question is, under this administration, will they use that authority?
Yeah, it's clearly the authorities with the STB. And then when I look at who are the institutional shareholders of these various railroad companies, it's a little bit troubling to see so many of the same shareholding groups controlling all of these railroads. So I know that the Surface Transportation Board is the place where the antitrust work for railroads happens, but in a different moment, one could imagine the Justice Department having some say in how Wall Street's investments are shaping, because we know the management of the railroads are constrained by Wall Street activist investor groups like Ancora, et cetera. So is there anything there in terms of the Wall Street's engagement and manipulation of the rail business model that you think, is there another pathway?
It isn't just rail, in particular with private equity. And now it's doctors' practices, it's nursing homes. Industry after industry is being gutted for short-term profit for one or another part of Wall Street, whether it's private equity or publicly traded firms who are pressured to increase the rate of return or their dividends or whatever else on the stock. It has become sort of the dictum that the only reason for a corporation to exist is to profit the shareholders. It used to be that a balance between what products they were providing and at what price and how that benefited the public and workers, and profits for the stockholders. Now it's totally one-sided. And this is certainly not a Congress or administration that's going to deal meaningfully with that. If only we could communicate or better communicate what is causing the middle class to lose ground. And these tiny minority of the country who are private equity or investors making obscene amounts of money that they could never spend. But right now, that's an open question whether we can convince enough people, given the social media, the distortions in the media, and all the other things that are out there. So it's an incredible challenge. I'm still engaged in the fight as much as I can, and I've got colleagues in Congress, including my successor, who are engaged in that fight. We can hope in the end somehow we can pull the blinders off people and turn things around. So I think that's about it.
Yeah, well, I hope that we can do that. And I do wonder if you think that we can offer a populism that appeals to the best in people instead of the worst in them. And if rail and Wall Street are actually some of the ways that we create buyer's remorse in those who've laid down or praying at the altar of Trump and the negative, hateful populism we see there. Do you see any signs before we wrap up? I know that you've talked about doing a book. Would this kind of progressive populism offering these sorts of real solutions be part of what a strategy that you would propose?
Well, we just saw the big so-called beautiful bill. The Republicans have gotten smarter at their deception. They put all the worst parts of the bill off until after the midterm election, which will be massive cuts to Medicare and Medicaid. It isn't just Medicaid, it's Medicare too. It's going to take a big hit. And you'll see red areas much more impacted than blue areas of this country. Rural hospitals are going to close by the dozens or tens of dozens. And it's going to be a disaster for healthcare and for the people in those areas. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen until after the next election. And it's hard to tell people, oh, you got a rebate check, but wait a minute, you're going to lose your healthcare in your hospital. They say, no, we heard that they fixed that. They're going to give some money to the rural hospitals and they'll stay in business. No, it's nowhere near enough funding to keep the rural hospitals open. So it's a battle of words and a cynical strategy on the part of the Republicans to screw people only in a major way after the next election.
And the promise of reshoring, all this free trade bullshit that we've talked about, the idea of reshoring, stuff, bringing stuff back, or even keeping what little is left. If people can't get service and they're forced to put it on trucks, isn't that just going to create more consolidation? Do we have a way of speaking to small towns and small businesses, smaller manufacturers, to create support for a different vision for the future of our transportation as a foundation for our economy?
Well, if the shippers will engage much more individually and vocally with the Congress and in social media and in this debate, we could educate and bring people along. Like Nebraska is supportive. A lot of people in Nebraska, the powers that be, say, wait a minute, there's going to be a lot more business through Nebraska on the rails. This could be good for us. Yeah, maybe it's good for one state. It's a disaster in so many other ways all across the country. But, your local agriculture producer or your local, factory that's dependent upon rail, they need to communicate with their communities and say, hey, if this goes through, I think we're going out of business. So you're going to lose all these jobs.
Thank you very much for spending this time with us. We really appreciate it. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your summer and that you get lots of time in those beautiful places that you help preserve.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Reconnect America is a podcast by Solutionary Rail. Background music by my old bandmates in Oda Proda. You can find this show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or a paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. Pitch in and get involved by visiting solutionaryrail.org. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to build a movement.